I've always known that being a performer at the caliber, at the level that I was at that age would have a shelf life. And I've had yoga on my horizon for a really long time in terms of growing into it as a career.
Welcome back to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reika and I am your host. If you are a returning listener, thank you so much for keep coming back and listening to the podcast every week. And if you're new, welcome to my podcast, Full-Time Yoga Teacher. This is a podcast where I interview full-time yoga teachers from across the world to find out about their journey, to learn about their journey, to understand how they got to where they are in their teaching career. I do interview mostly full-time yoga teachers, but I also interview part-time teachers, as well as somebody who used to be a yoga teacher who no longer is teaching. So I think it's interesting to get a full picture of why some teachers become full-time, why some chose to stay part-time, why some may choose to even leave teaching altogether, or how uniquely they make their life in a way that they can do what they love, which is, in this case, yoga. Some are teaching yoga, some are working in the yoga industry, or some are managing studios and teaching yoga, and some are traveling around the world teaching yoga. So I think it's so fun to be able to share the journeys of different paths yoga teachers take to make this into their career. And this is the kind of information I wish I had when I was a newer teacher trying to navigate the world of trying to teach yoga as my full-time job. I think hearing about other yoga teachers' journey, it's so inspiring and can give you great ideas, and also gives us opportunity to understand the different path that's out there. It doesn't have to be just one path, which can make it challenging, but also fun and beautiful at the same time. So I hope you're enjoying this podcast as you are listening. I don't have too many updates this week to share, except for I've been thinking a lot about where the yoga world is going. And I only see this limited yoga world view because I live in LA, and this is where I did my teacher training, and this is where I teach and I live. So I get to see the kind of trend and patterns of the yoga world here in Los Angeles, California, which I know it's not the representation of the whole yoga world out there in different parts of the United States and different part of the world. But I've been having a deeper reflections of where it's going, where it's headed. And that's something I'm maybe thinking about talking about this topic in the upcoming solo episode, because I would love to share my thoughts, but also would love to hear from you listeners who might be listening from LA or outside of LA, different countries. I would love to know, how is the yoga world going where you are? Is it thriving? Do you see many studios closing? Is yoga growing, or is it stagnant, or is it dying? I don't want to say dying, but like maybe it's not as popular as it used to be. Who knows? So I think that's the reflections that I think I'm going to talk about in the upcoming solo episode. But like I said, I can only share my own experience and what I have been seeing with my own eyes and have been experiencing and hearing other people experience, which could possibly be very, very, very different than what you are experiencing and wherever you live in the world. So if you have any thoughts, reflections of what you think yoga world is going, how has it been shifting and changing and evolving in the past 5-10 years, and where do you think it's headed? I would love to hear from you, because that'll give me better understanding before I do my solo episode. So that's something been on my mind quite a bit lately. So if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear from you. You can message me on Instagram. That's where I'm most active. My handle is @ReikaYoga. Or you can also message me, send me an email from my website if you're not a social media user, or you just prefer sending me email on the website. So my website is www.reikayoga.com. And I'll have all the links on the show notes, so you don't have to remember the handle or the website. There'll be a link there if you want to go there. One announcement to make before I get started with this week's episode is that I have an upcoming workshop that I'm not teaching, but it's part of my mentorship. I invite guest teachers to come and teach for my mentorship program. Usually guest teachers come about once a month. And for March, Allie is coming to teach an inversion workshop specifically for yoga teachers. And if you're not a yoga teacher, but you are a serious student, you are also welcome to join this workshop. So she's going to go over inversions and, anatomy and biomechanics that goes into being able to do an inversion poses. But also, because it's teacher-specific workshop, she's going to give us how can we become a better inversion teacher, maybe a little bit of hands-on assist, what kind of cues, different variations and props that you can use to make inversion a part of your teaching as well. So I'm super excited about this workshop. It's happening in person in Long Beach, but we are also going to Zoom in people. So it's live stream and in person. So you can be joining this workshop from anywhere in the world. And there will be also recording available. So if you happen to be busy that day, cannot make it, but still want to practice or still want to get the information of this workshop, then you can still sign up and I'll send you the recording. So the workshop is happening March 1st, which is Saturday, from 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific time, which is going to be 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern time. And like I said, it's in person in Long Beach, California, or you can live stream it and practice from home or watch the recording, which is a fun way to make this workshop available to all and accessible. The workshop cost is $44, and the link to sign up for this workshop will be on the show notes of this podcast. And if you have any questions about this workshop, you're always welcome to reach out to me or Allie. I'll link both of our Instagram on the show notes so you can reach out to any of us. So that's happening in March 1st. Okay, so today I'm sharing an interview and a conversation I had with my friend Bianca. Bianca and I met in Annie Carpenter's continuing education training as part of the 300 hours. And we met in Oakland a couple years ago, and we connected right away. And I really enjoyed having so many conversations with her. And she's also from LA. She lives in LA, so that was a good common point we had. And we also assisted Annie's 200-hour teacher training together last year. So I got to know her really well, and I'm just so excited that I get to share her journey on this podcast. She has such a unique and beautiful story to share. And in this interview, she just shares so many beautiful golden nuggets everywhere, so much wisdom that she shared about so many different things. So I hope you enjoy the conversation that I had with Bianca. So Bianca is a former Olympic level rhythmic gymnast, Cirque du Soleil artist, and dedicated yoga teacher. Her journey through movement, from elite athletics to dance and acrobatics, shapes her unique approach to yoga, blending asana, breathwork, and mythology. Bianca trained under Annie Carpenter and has taught at UCLA, USC, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and more. She now shares her work at Center for Yoga in LA, and through her own platform, she teaches lunar yoga. She'll explain more about this during the interview. So in this episode, we're going to dive into SmartFLOW method, since we are both SmartFLOW teacher, as well as the essence of yoga and how yoga can translate into different movement modalities. And she also talked about her journey of becoming a mother and continuing to teach yoga and other movement modalities. So we had really good conversation in this interview. So I hope you enjoy it, and I will speak to you on the other side. Welcome, Bianca, for coming to join me on the Full-Time Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm so excited that I get to have this conversation with you. And just quickly for the listener, Bianca and I met in Oakland. The first time we met, we were both taking Annie Carpenter's continuing education trainings. And ever since then, I got to know Bianca more and more because we assisted Annie's 200 together, and we, continue to assist her, and we continue to see each other in Annie's trainings and whatnot. So I'm so excited and also grateful that I have you in my circle of SmartFLOW community. So thank you so much for being here. Please share with the listeners, where are you joining from today?
Hi, Reika. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and also to know you and to have gotten to know you over the last, year and a half, 2 years almost, something like that, maybe a year. No, time is slippery. I'm in Joshua Tree, California at the moment, and it's beautiful outside. There's the stillness and the starkness of the desert, and I really love it here.
And where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Los Angeles, California.
Okay. And I know you have such a beautiful and unique story in life that I'm very excited to ask you more about and, share that with the listeners. But maybe, I guess, quickly, how did you first get introduced to yoga, and what made you decide that you want to become a yoga teacher?
My first introduction to yoga, I was quite young. I had a teacher who taught something that was an offshoot of yoga, and it was a part of I was a competitive gymnast growing up, and it was a part of our gymnastics training. And it was very much about body alignment, not so much the philosophical practices of yoga, but more about the alignment of the body in a similar fashion to the way that yoga practices asana. And also there was a sense of listening and stillness that came alongside with that, at least for me, in these sessions that we would do with this coach. And then yoga as a more serious, that I started to take a little, more seriously as a practice as a lineage of, the lineage of yoga, began when I was, I was coming out of the circus. I had been on tour for a few years. So I must have been in my early 20s. And I discovered pretty early Annie Carpenter. She was one of my very first teachers of a more serious yoga practice. I'd been, dabbling on and off with it, but not as seriously as when I met Annie. And then I've had many teachers over the years, but she's kind of the one that I've stuck with.
Well, I definitely want to get to the Annie Carpenter part. But before that, you said you were practicing and you were doing gymnastics growing up. Is that something you started really young? And then you also said circus. So I'm kind of curious of how did the gymnastic path lead to circus path?
Oh, yeah. So it feels like a different life. I certainly was a different person, you know how it is. But I started when I was very young. I started gymnastics training when I was 5. So that was 3 hours a day, 5 days a week of gymnastics. Now I started off with artistic gymnastics. And that's the sport that you see, Simone Biles do, for example, with the bars and the beam and the vault. And I went to a summer camp where we were doing all kinds of different gymnastic affiliated sports. And I remember very clearly this day where this woman came in, new coach. She came in and she was carrying a bag with her, and she put down her bag, and we're all there waiting, to take her class. And out of her bag, it felt like magic. She pulled out a ribbon, and she started twirling this ribbon in spirals all around her. And I just felt like, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. And she then became my coach. And then, long story short, I wound up taking a very deep dive into the sport of rhythmic gymnastics. And this is the sport with also a gymnastic sport under the umbrella of gymnastics. Ribbon, ball, clubs, rope, hoop, those are the apparatus. And it's a lot more based in dance, ballet specifically. We did ballet every day. And that was something that became my primary focus all up until I stopped competing in the sport when I was, later in my teens. So I did that for quite a long time, and I went quite far competitively and with my body and with my mind down a rabbit hole for quite a few years with rhythmic gymnastics, and it got, I became an elite rhythmic gymnast. So started competing. I was on the national team. I competed all over the world for the US. I won the national championships all around 5 times, 5 separate times. And then I was an alternate on the Olympic team in 1992. And I won the Pan American Games. This is the games for all of South, Central, North America. And I won gold with those. And at a certain point, I just, for many, many reasons, I hit a wall, and I just knew it was time to stop. And it was a big shift in my life. And this was around my senior year of high school. And I was training so much that I was doing home study. I was training 8 to 10 hours every day as a gymnast, and just traveling so much all around the world, competing for the US. That I was always very highly academic, but and school was very important to me, and education still totally important to me. But I wasn't going to a physical school and at that time. And so I went back to school for my senior year of high school, which was wild for me. Going from, being this elite gymnast, hyper-focused, and all of a sudden just being in the context of a high school with all of its social aspects and dramas that were just foreign to me. And then fast forward maybe about, I don't know, a year, 2 years, because I wound up going to college, and I studied comparative religion there. And while I was in college, I came home. I was studying a lot of Eastern religions at that particular time. And I came home from a class called Women in Buddhism, and I had a message on my answering machine. So, okay, this is dating me a little bit, but on my answering machine, I had a message from Cirque du Soleil, and they had asked me. The casting director was calling me from Montreal and asked me if I would be interested to come to Montreal tomorrow, like the very next day. And so I wound up calling her back, and I didn't leave the next day, but I left a week later, and thinking I would just be there for a week to kind of see if I was the right fit for them, if they were the right fit for me. And it was a big choice to try to, I was going to a very prestigious school. I was going to Amherst College in Massachusetts, and kind of thought I was leaving that world behind me. I didn't realize I could make a living or create a career out of what I had done my whole life. And once, that week had passed, I realized this was home. This is where I needed to be. So I made some phone calls and had some friends pack up my stuff, put it in storage, and I just never went back. And thus began my career in the circus, which still goes on. But I've been in this. It wasn't the first circus I worked for, but it was the first tour that I did. And I was on tour with Cirque du Soleil for a few years, and then continued to dive into that career, whether it was traveling with circus companies or dance companies or film, television, music industry. It just kind of, Cirque du Soleil opened the doors for people like me. And I'm grateful for that. And so I kind of was at the beginning of the heyday of circus in all of its commercial glory, and how it sort of, branched out then into other aspects of the entertainment industry and the arts.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. There's like so many offshoot questions I want to ask from that, but to bring it back to, I guess, yoga, was yoga part of your life during this time that you were in circus and traveling and performing and training? Was yoga already part of your day-to-day life?
Yes. So yoga was definitely, most definitely a part of my life during this time. In fact, a big part. It became more, it grew into a bigger and bigger tree in the forest of my life. And it began, maybe I'll start it with when I left my first tour with Cirque du Soleil. And that I left the tour with a lot of injuries. As you'd imagine, I was an aerial acrobat with that tour. And that's been my primary discipline in circus arts is contortion, rhythmic gymnastics, offshoots, and aerial acrobatics. And it's quite harsh on the body, to be in Cirque du Soleil. I left the tour with a lot of injury. And when I left that initial tour, came back to Los Angeles, and lucky for me, yoga was, a big deal in Los Angeles at that time. And I believe it still is. And I was drawn to yoga because it was a place for me to be able to practice in my body, but also be able to dive deeper into the subtle realms of the body and the mind experience in a way that I needed deeply. I knew it, I intuited it, and when I found it, the resonance was so strong that I knew I have a dharma, a path with that. And that has continued to grow as I've gotten older. I've always known that being a performer at the caliber, at the level that I was at that age would have a shelf life. And I've had yoga on my horizon for a really long time in terms of growing into it as a career. And it's always ridden alongside my career as an artist. And I find that those two things resonate with each other really profoundly and beautifully, because they both ask you to go to deeper and more subtle realms of the human experience. And in my life, they've always deeply fed each other. The path of the artist, the path of the yogi, the path of the teacher. These things together, I think, at least for me, have created a trilogy, a sort of triangle of experience that I hope to bring to my students.
Wow, thank you for sharing all that. I love how you said trilogy of path of yoga, artist, and teacher. So I'm curious that when did you take your first 200 hour? Was it in LA, and was it kind of in between the tours, or how did the first 200 hour come in place?
The first 200 hour I took with Annie Carpenter. It was Annie Carpenter. There was Kia Miller, Bonnie Turpin, and Joan Hyman. And it was through YogaWorks in the Pacific Palisades. And I believe it was it was one of the shorter programs. So it was really concentrated because at the time I was still touring a lot. I didn't have, time for a long drawn out thing. And this was before things were online. So everything was in person, but now I look at as a luxury. And it was in 2009. That was my first teacher's training. So I'd already been taking classes with Annie for a little bit less than a decade, or around a decade at that time.
Wow. So that, I feel like, it sounds like a dream team, the teacher trainings, teachers that you had, and it's so amazing that you were already practicing with Annie for close to a decade or about a decade, and then taking her teacher training. And I feel like maybe these days I hear a lot of people who just started yoga going straight into teacher training after a month of practicing yoga, or 2 months, or even less than a year. So I think back in the day, it seems like it was more of a requirement or maybe norms to be practicing for quite some time before you take a teacher training. And I think that's something maybe that is kind of quite lost now. anybody who pays can take teacher training these days.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's pros and cons with that. I think, if I had if I had shifted into teaching at that time, I'd be in a different place now. Although, let me say it this way, I was already teaching, but I was primarily teaching circus arts and dance. And then once I did my yoga's teacher's training, I started to pull some of those things. It made me a much better teacher. And I started to pull some of those things into my classes. But in terms of teaching, yoga as a specific yoga class, that didn't come until later. And I know what you mean. I think, to be able to have, it's just a different thing that you offer when you've had a really long practice yourself, and you have something different to give to your student than if you haven't been. But see, I also think that whatever it is that you've been through in your life, as long as you make yourself vulnerable enough as a teacher to be able to share those things, and that can be really hard to know how to succinctly share those things as a craft that takes a lot of time. But I do believe that whatever it is that we're teaching, especially yoga, we're teaching more than an asana practice. We're teaching about life experience, and maybe I'm just being optimistic when I say that, but I do think that that's ultimately what I'm hoping to bring to my classes.
Mm. And it seems like, before you even joined a Cirque du Soleil, it sounds like you were already very interested in Eastern philosophy. So the academic side of learning philosophy and religions were there. And then mastery of the physical practice with the gymnastic and getting into yoga. And like you said, it felt so aligned because, I feel like yoga can combine both like philosophical spirituality and also this like physical awareness and movement together. And I can totally see how you were drawn to both, and you can kind of combine these two to bring to your teaching experience, how you teach, which I think.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Reika. I think since I was very young, I have felt a deep connection to spirit, to the spiritual life. And, I think that's one of the things also that pulled me into yoga, was that that's a place where not only was it accepted, but revered, celebrated, and arguably the core. I think it depends on how you practice yoga, but if you want it, if you're interested in it, those deeper levels, those subtler levels are available and waiting as a sort of root of practice, the root and the fruit of the practice. So I began this thing called lunar yoga when the pandemic began, and that's where I felt like my worlds were really coming all together. I started that, I was already teaching a lot, and once I realized that, in the situation I was in, I moved everything to online, and I know not everybody did, so that's why I say it that way. But for me, it made more sense to move everything online. And I think for most of us, we did. And I wound up starting something called, like I said, lunar yoga, which brought together this aspect of the comparative religion aspect with yoga philosophy, with its intersection with arts, and then an asana embodiment practice and pranayama. And that's been going strong now since I began it in, a week. I guess it was the first lunar yoga class was just 2 or 3 weeks after the pandemic began. And I was just trying to figure out Zoom, and it was train wreck in the beginning, technically. But I've kept it really steady, and it started off with just the doing these practices on the new moon and the full moon, and then it's developed over the years into what it is today, which people come. It's still almost all online. I just did my first, and in fact, I just did my first lunar yoga class in-person online hybrid, which was great for the winter solstice. And that was really, it's something I've wanted to do for a really long time. But I've developed this program that has created a community that's worldwide. And it's been really, really lovely to get to know all these different people from all over the world who are interested in some similar things to what I'm interested in.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. I think I heard you talk about this lunar yoga class that you teach, but definitely we'll put the link to those classes so if anybody listening who is interested in that class they can join from anywhere in the world. And it sounds really cool how you can kind of combine everything that you love and you are drawn to and passionate about. But I'm curious, kind of going back a little bit, when you took teacher training with Annie and the great team. But you went back to being on Cirque du Soleil or being on tour again. And I know you
Mm-hmm.
were teaching, not yoga, you were bringing yoga into what you're teaching, but you're teaching, I guess, gymnastic or aerial art as you were performing and traveling. And so I'm curious, how was, and you told me earlier that you knew that there was a shelf life to this career path, but then you felt
Mm-hmm.
it's like long term, it can support you throughout. So I'm curious of that, I guess, transition after teacher training. Yoga was part of your teaching, but you kind of stayed in that career of traveling, touring, performing. And how did that slowly transition to what it is now for you?
Yeah, I think one of the big shifts for me in terms of teaching more consistently was having children. And I started, even though I continued to maintain my career as a choreographer, director, performer after I had children, there was a definite path that became wider of teaching when I became pregnant with my first child. And I was teaching at one of my first, studios that I was teaching at, as with that particular shift was for with children, and that was at Le Petit Cirque, which is a beautiful circus company that focuses on very talented youth, and they do shows all over the world as well. And I became sort of quote unquote master teacher there, and would come in and also choreograph for them. And I began working for different studios around, and still continuing on along my path of being a yogi and taking trainings and pulling what I was learning into the context of my other classes. And so, yeah, that this path has just continued to widen and get richer. It's been a very natural evolution. Began focusing. I think there was just a dharma that is coming to fruition, that came to fruition around focusing primarily. I think as the path began to widen, another path also began to shoot off about yoga to teach yoga classes as a career, and go into teachers trainings and go into retreats, and that's been once again just a natural evolution of the teaching path for me.
And it seems like it was a conscious choice for you to kind of want to pursue teaching yoga as a career, because for a long time, it seems like prior, the performance or choreography, touring, traveling, that was more of a main path in your career for so long. And I don't know, from what I'm hearing and also some of the conversation I had with you in the past, it seemed like there was a conscious effort to bring more yoga, teaching yoga into your path.
100%. Yes, 100%. And, I think it's really interesting. And this is maybe a part of the conversation that, we can get into a little bit, but I don't know. And I think that's okay to say. But I do think that it is possible to have this multifaceted career where I teach yoga and I choreograph and perform. And those things, being an artist and being a teacher, like I said before, I believe they're really mutually beneficial. And I think they create a richness of experience for an audience as well as for students. That's what I have found in the last 20 plus years of teaching, is that they intertwine and they vine around each other in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, I feel like they also feed each other too, and
Yes.
bring yoga to that performance world or circus world, but then you can bring that to the yoga world too. And yeah, I feel like it feeds so well into each other, and that, like, you have so much experience that it's almost like you have to share both, like it feeds into each other. You can't separate them.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I'm teaching a professional acrobat, or let's say an aerial acrobat, who is either in Cirque du Soleil or of that caliber, teaching them how to breathe and how to control their thoughts, how to control and in a yogic way, you know what I mean, can be incredibly instrumental for them in maintaining their career and maintaining their health and maintaining the stability that they need to have in their body and mind in order to be able to go out and literally risk your life every time you go on stage. I mean, can you imagine the use of breath before you go out 30, 40, 50 feet in the air and perform, where you're doing these feats where one wrong move can mean the difference between life and death. I'm not being dramatic. This is real. And if you know how to stay in the moment and you can use the techniques of yoga, and I can bring those techniques to these artists of how to stay in the moment, because you cannot get out of the moment when you're up there in the air. You must be present now. And I think those things feed each other. I think it's because I learned that at a very young age as a gymnast and all the pressures that I had. I mean, 1 minute and a half with the world watching to show what you've done your entire life. And this is the only chance that you get, because this is the national, this is the Pan American Games. This is the World Championships. This is whatever it is. Between that, or you're going out on stage and you're doing these incredible feats where you're putting your life at risk. I can't see how the practices of yoga won't help you there, especially when we're talking about being in the moment, especially when we're talking about focusing the mind, drishti, ekagrata, pinpoint precision, with all focus coming on to one point. And vice versa, I think taking this idea of, I think when a lot of people think of performance or a performer, they think that that performer might feel that experience is all about them. Like when I'm on stage, everybody's looking at me, it's all about me. But I've never felt that way. I've always felt that I am a channel for something bigger. And that thing that is bigger is the show itself, the idea, the concept, the spirit of the energy, the prana, the life force of whatever it is that I'm there to express, right? And that can be brought to the yoga studio. This idea of you're allowing the prana to move through the body, to shape the body, to form into form, like we do when we're on stage. So these are some examples of what I mean, where they really can feed each other.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. I remember when you said we're not performing for ourselves. There's a channeling that's happening. And when you said that, it reminded me of Judith Lassiter, the restorative yoga teacher, she often tells story of, as a teacher, we're just a vessel. It's not about me, and what I teach and how creative, different I am, but we're just like, we're passing on this, beautiful knowledge and tradition of yoga, and we're just a vessel, and we just have to trust in yoga. And it just
That's it.
that.
That's it. And you're creating an experience for your audience to have. You're creating an experience for your students to have. So there's a lot of parallels. There's a lot of similar lines.
Yeah.
And, having to feel like this sort of black and white notion of having to make a choice between the two doesn't resonate with me. It's all part of the rich experience of the creative act of living.
I love that. And when I interviewed teachers for this podcast, it's almost everybody all have, like, even thinking about financially, almost everybody have different streams of income to be able to do this as our living and, be able to support ourselves. I think it's quite interviewing others, and my experience myself, it's just helpful to have not just teach yoga at this one studio and that's it, that's my income. There needs to be different streams of income, I feel like, in people in this
Yeah.
career path to also make this sustainable. So I think having teaching another form of movement, or some people might do, work for another yoga company as admin, or Pilates teacher too. There's so many different unique way that yoga teachers have utilized their strength and skill sets to have such a rich and diverse career. So I totally understand that, they're not separate, they're together, but also you just have so much knowledge, experience that you can offer, not only in yoga teacher or yoga classes in a studio setting, but you also have so much other things that you do, which brings me to the question of, for listeners listening, what does your, I guess, typical, I don't know, it doesn't have to be week, but typical work look like for you? Because I know you do more than just go teach a yoga class at a studio.
Yes. So, and I'm really glad that you're bringing this up, Reika, because I think that this is very true for the times. I think this is really important for us to talk about, because I think people can feel, if I think people can be hard on themselves if they feel like, oh, well, I can't make all of my income from just yoga teaching, so that must mean I'm not a good yoga teacher. And I think that's completely incorrect way of looking at things. And I think times have changed. I think that for many of us, our teachers had an environment in which it was easier to do that. And I'm not saying they didn't work really hard, and I'm not saying, it was a breeze. I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form. And I honestly don't completely know their experience. So, but I do think that these days it can be really challenging to make, unless you've been in it for a really long time. I think, starting out teaching yoga, I think can be harder now. A lot has changed post pandemic. Of course, we know this. And I think the yoga world has changed from being a part of it since, the late 90s and into now. I just see it's really different. And I think it's, important for us to talk about that. I think it's an important part of the conversation. So I teach yoga. I teach circus arts, aerial acrobatics, dance, and I choreograph and direct shows. And I teach a lot of workshops, and I teach something that I call the physical creative, which is basically a conglomeration of different practices that I've learned over the many years via the performing arts, as well as yoga. And those things are this particular class is mostly about how we can ask or turn to the body for creativity, and getting out of our head and into our body to resonate with and thus tap into the deep creative experience that is the physical body. And then start to peel away the layers into the more subtle body. And it's a lot of play, and it's a lot of games, and it's a lot of fun. And I've taught that for many years now, and I'll teach it at universities like USC or UCLA, or for organizations like Young Arts Foundation or Penn USA. I'll teach to writers, or I've taught it at in corporate environments, where you'll have like a CEO next to, a janitor, and playing all together, and I don't know who's who. And it's that I find to be a really, really rich experience for a lot of people. And I'll even pull aspects of that sense of play and vulnerability into my yoga classes. It's so yeah. And my source, and just getting into the nuts and bolts of it, my sources of income come from all these different places.
Thank you for sharing that. So Bianca and I are both certified SmartFLOW teacher, which is a method that Annie Carpenter developed. And we, after graduating from her 300 hours, we kind of go through a separate, like a process to become certified SmartFLOW teacher. And after going through that certification, we're both able to teach a class called SmartFLOW. And I always enjoy talking to Bianca because we both teach SmartFLOW classes. So how are you enjoying teaching SmartFLOW classes?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Reika? I love talking with you about it too, because it is such a specific approach to yoga. And I really, after having been a student of Annie's for so long, and kind of being around as this method kind of more, has organically developed in my own practice because of my longevity with her. It was beautiful to study it from a more sort of, I don't want to say academic, because that's not really right, but from the perspective of her teaching it as a method, as opposed to coming to classes, because it already lived in my body after being with her for so long. And then to approach it from, well, this is the breakdown of how you actually teach it. I developed even more respect for it as a method, understanding the sort of from a more intellectual, systematic approach, the language of SmartFLOW. And I love to teach it because I really think it's so intelligent, and it even though it's rooted in classical yoga, it still feels really fresh and alive and fluid, because it adapts itself to not only modern anatomy and what we know about the science of physical body, but also because not only is it malleable to it's rooted in classical yoga, but it's also more, it stays fresh and alive because of its connection and its understanding of the physical body in a more modern context. So it kind of evolves, as we understand the body, the method itself evolves. And then on top of that, it designed in a way that every single individual's body learns to adapt itself, or learns, or the method adapts itself. Maybe I should say, maybe it's a mutual co-adaptation with the individual body to the method. And then the whole system of sequencing is really beautiful and highly developed. And I find it really a pleasure to teach.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. I just wanted to ask one more questions about SmartFLOW. How do you think learning about SmartFLOW method and also learning to become a SmartFLOW teacher, how do you think it has influenced or impacted your teaching as a whole?
I've seen it impact my teaching, whether I'm teaching yoga, whether I'm teaching acrobatics or dance or aerial acrobatics. I think it's made me a better teacher in all of those disciplines. And that was the surprise for me. I wasn't expecting that. These things that we do with SmartFLOW, especially like the idea of inquiry inside of the body, that specifically, I'll just give that as an example. this is something that we do in the dance world. This is something that we do in the circus world, is like, how does this one thing live within your body? But because of the sort of that plus the systematic approach to the body and the sequencing that SmartFLOW is, I've seen that kind of open up into my other teaching of different methods, completely different genres in the body. And that's also really, really beautiful.
Wow, that sounds so beautiful to hear because I don't teach other modalities. I only teach yoga. So it's so interesting to hear that knowledge and the skill sets now that you have of teaching SmartFLOW also translates to other type of teaching that you do. I have really similar but different experience of like, for me it's mostly yoga experience, but I have noticed like even different teachers or even physical therapists trying to explain something, like I think of it as like, oh, that's a movement principle. Oh, like this
Yes, yes.
effort and return to center. Like everything kind of like links to other knowledge that I hear or other conversation I have. I noticing it linking back to SmartFlow method and movement principle.
Yeah. It's cool that you say that, because I was choreographing a piece not that long ago on a ballet company. And I remember trying to help this dancer break down what was happening inside of this particular jump that he was doing. And I could see it. I could see it because of this idea of the movement principles. And I said, if you just do a little bit more rotation of that leg, internal rotation of that back leg as you jump, then you're going to be able to land the way you want. And it works. Like it was really cool. I've seen that happen a lot. Even I taught at USC recently. I teach something called the physical creative, and it's teaching people how to access their creativity via the body. And it's all about cooperation and receptivity and open awareness and all of these things. And even then I could feel like the notions, for example, of that, of the principles of the body coming in there when I'm watching the students who are not dancers, they're not yogis, but I'm asking them to move through space, and I can see also in them the movement principles, and I can feel how that helps.
That's so fascinating and so beautiful to hear. And I'm sure Annie would probably really appreciating us talking about how it applies everywhere.
Namaste, Annie.
I want to ask questions about how becoming a mom has maybe changed or have, maybe change in perception or approach to this career that you have created. As somebody who built your career around movement, teaching and performing, choreographing, and there are worldly famous senior yoga teachers out there with children, but I think it's maybe a little less than teachers we see. How I perceive it as like have made it. They have successful yoga teaching career that has lasted for decades and decades and decades. I don't see too many yoga teachers who maybe even talk about publicly about like having how transition they went through to have children, or they chose not to have children. So I'm curious, with somebody who built their career life around movement, how has having children changed maybe your career or maybe your priority? And also you still are doing all the things you love, so it is possible. Like I want listeners to know that like you can still be a mom and still do what you love and continue to do love. So I'm curious about the balance that you have found, or maybe any challenges that you found, or maybe like it felt like it was a smooth transition for you.
Reika, I've said this before. I'm really glad that you're bringing this up. I find this is a very important issue, and I do think this is a women's issue. I think it's not only about using the body, but that's a huge thing for those of us who teach or perform or use our bodies to make a living. But I also think it's a broader women's issue for any woman who's trying to maintain a career and be a mother, because we still live in a society in which, I'm just going to be frank, a lot of doors close when, or they can when you decide to become a mother. And I think that it's a big, it's for many of us, it's it's an uphill battle in terms of perception, and not only our own perception, but the perception of others around us, that yes, one can mother, one can be a provider, one can have a fulfilling career. I think just kind of touching upon, this is similar to what we were talking about earlier. We live with these minds that want to compartmentalize and put ourselves and others into categories. And sometimes it's very challenging for us to open up our minds into, oh, yeah, you can be more than one thing. And you can also be really good at more than one thing. Like, I can be a really good mother and a good yoga teacher. I can be both of those things. And really, it's about how to structure your life, your time, and creatively do so in a way that sort of defies your own preconceived notions or the perceptions of others, and sort of pushing the boundaries of those boxes that we create. But it really, I do believe that it starts with your own perception and a lot of will. It takes a lot of will, but it's definitely not impossible. And I find it profoundly enriching. And I think that me as a mother enriches and beyond words, me as a teacher, me as a performer and artist and creator. But I do, and I see it a lot in the performing arts and also in teaching, especially for women, that a lot of my mentors and collaborators who are women and have been what I perceive as very successful don't have children, and some not even don't have partners, just because of that notion that women have to work a lot harder to get where we get. And that's just from my perception. We have to work harder, be more prepared, be more on top of it, and willing to output more in order to be on, similar financial or quote unquote success level as a man would. So for me, in my career, I just continue to show up every day. It's because it's a daily practice of how can I continue to be there as much as I'd like to and want to for my family and my children, and how much can I continue to also show up for and be there 100% for my students and my career and this path of creativity in general.
Do you think you have pulled back a bit since having children, or maybe, I don't know, that I can rephrase that to like, maybe you have a more of a priority on where you really want to like spend your time, energy, effort towards, in terms of obviously showing up as a mom, but in your teaching career, did you find that you have to maybe streamline, maybe teach fewer offerings, or maybe travel less, but you're really focusing on the things that it matters to you?
I think I've had to get really hyper focused, and I think that I've learned how to be more and more efficient with time management. Time management is huge when you have so much going on. I live in a, in the way that our family is configured. I'm the primary caretaker for the children, and at the same time, I'm running a career. So figuring out how to schedule everything is of the utmost importance for me. And I just have to be, on time. Once I create those schedules, things have to flow. If I want to get everything done, things have to be able to flow, and staying really focused. And that's another thing that, yoga has taught me, is how to maintain that focus for long periods of time through, meditation, pranayama practices, obviously asana, but ultimately I think my practice has gotten more and more subtle over the years. And although, yes, I practice asana, I also, I have a very committed practice to pranayama meditation. And I also, I play harmonium and I do chanting, and that is another way of finding that flow and getting into that drishti, that ekagrata.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think yes, I have made a lot of sacrifices in order to, and there was especially when I decided to have children. This was a big shift for me, and it was scary. And it took me, I hem and hawed about it for a long time, and I got to parenthood late. But because I got to parenthood late, quote unquote late, I think it's kind of normal these days. But, at the time it felt late, and I had already lived a lot and done a lot in my career and felt very, very satiated. And so, but once I actually had my first child, it opened a world that I never knew existed. And it opened me to a love that I could have never even have conceived of. And I'm not going to say the career became less important. It shifted. And I could see that now with this new consciousness and a more expanded, for me, consciousness, I could see how these things could coexist. And I think this is part of that thing of like, that I keep coming back to, of not feeling that life or you have to only be one thing, that there is a vast array. And yes, putting your energy into certain branches will help grow the tree in the way that you want to. I'm not saying, I definitely don't live my life where I think I want to do everything. I don't even want to do that. But I do believe that these things, when done with consciousness and awareness, can coexist and feed each other in really beautiful and profoundly enriching ways for yourself and for those with whom you come in contact.
Thank you, Bianca. That's so beautifully said. And when I think of yoga teachers who's also a mother, and I feel like you, Dre, there's a few other that I really look up to as like, it's so important to have a role model in that's like, okay, they're doing it and they still are teaching, they still love yoga, they still have a career. And I think, I just think it's so important that we have someone like you who's actually, you're doing it. And, I know it's not easy, but you are always, I feel like you do it with beautiful grace, that we get to at least see a great role model in the yoga world. So I appreciate you.
Thank you, Reika. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. It's, how it is. It's nice to feel seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So just a couple more questions before we wrap up. But I know you said earlier, yoga world has changed and you've been in it. So you have seen quite a bit. And you also seen, and you've been a student of Annie for so long that you've probably seen her evolve as a teacher, teacher trainer, and in being the yoga world. So I guess this is a little bit two-part question. I'm curious about how you saw Annie change. That's one thing. But also how you've been in the yoga world for so long. So how have you seen the yoga world change and evolve since you've been in it? And what changes do you appreciate and are fond of? And is there any changes that you feel are maybe disheartening or a little bit sad about?
Yeah. So I feel that there's pros and cons to when I first began practicing yoga more diligently, maybe for lack of a better word, I would say that, everything was in person. I mean, you could learn from a book, but you went to your teacher in the flesh. And the commitment that it would take to get to that teacher or those teachers on a regular basis, I take into account as well. because it's part of the commitment. So, for example, where I live in Los Angeles, I would often, every single time I went to a yoga class, drive an hour to get there. And that was normal for me. It meant that much to me that I would do that. And my teachers, specifically, mostly Annie, it felt appropriate to take that much time out of my day to do that. And I think now, I'm sure that exists still, but because you can access yoga with your teacher, for many of us remotely now, it takes on a different tone or quality when you are doing it online, both as a teacher and as a student, that the benefit is that you have the practice at your fingertips. The con is that the experience is different. I don't know how to, I don't know. I still feel like I'm trying to figure it out, because I take classes all the time online and I teach classes online, and it's different than when I take classes in person or teach in person. But is it less important to have, is it more important to have that in-person experience or to practice? And I would say to practice. So it's a really good question, Reika, and I'm not sure I know. I still feel that this remote stuff is new to me, even though it's been 5 years. And I think it can be a very enriching experience. But I also think there's something really different about being in a physical space with somebody. So that's just in terms of like online versus in person, in terms of how yoga has changed. I've also seen a sort of trend for shorter and shorter yoga classes, which I personally understand, but I do think diminishes the return for the student. I do believe that when you have a longer, and this goes hand in hand with the idea of commitment, a longer practice, I think there's a different, more rich experience or fruit that can be had. You have time to sit after a pose and feel the nuance of the aftermath, the savor, the flavor of that asana pose, if you can just sit and breathe for a little bit after you do it. When you're trying to push all your asana practice into a 30-minute practice, do you really have time to go deeply into pranayama or meditation or shavasana? Can you really get out of it the thing that you would get? And that sounds extractive, and I don't mean it that way. But can you allow to rise to the surface what would arise to the surface after an hour and a half practice? Unless you're a really experienced yoga and you're yogi and you're used to going into that state really often, I think it's hard. So that is a trend I don't love. There's also a trend towards this corporate yoga experience, yoga class environment that's all about asana, that I really don't have personal interest in at all. And, I've gone into studios where there's sort of a script, and this is really different than Ashtanga. Okay. But like sort of because there's no lineage connected to it, it's kind of like disembodied and it becomes a workout class. And, I think we live in this sort of fast paced age of information where it's just so easy to get distracted. And I think that one of the primary reasons, at least I do yoga, is to pull me away from distraction and into truth. And for me, that just takes time. Time in terms of how much time I can give to my daily practice, and in terms of the longevity, how many years I've been practicing.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I definitely, when you talked about the online versus in person, I definitely see the trend of people are maybe less committed or less willing to take, let's say, like a week or 2 weeks off their life to go train with the teacher. And you might have to like drive a couple hours, or you might have to fly to go take this
Yeah.
special training for 2 weeks, or well, 1 month, or it could be 1 week, 5 days. I think that is, I think it has become harder and harder to ask for that commitment from students
Mm,
now because there's so much online offerings now that people are like, oh, I can do this training online from home. I can't make it to this day, so I can watch the recording later on the days that I miss. So it's just like I feel like it's different now. And then at the same time, online offerings can be so great. Like you said,
mm,
I also take online trainings too. And I also still try to make time to do in-person training that is in person. I have to show up, So I value both, but I think it's becoming harder to ask for that commitment from students these days. That is like
yeah.
travel, you have to be here. This is a time from this time to this time. We're in this training for 5 days straight or 1 week straight. I think maybe less people are signing up for those kind of trainings and more people are signing up for hybrid online and in person, or Zoom, and you have access to recordings. I feel like that is kind of becoming more easier for people to sign up to commit to that. And
I
which,
think so too, Rika. And I think having to do it all is the trend now for those of us, especially, those of us who are more, serious teachers. Serious is kind of a weird word, but who really are committed to providing a more complete yogic experience, yogic practice for our students. I think having to figure out how to do it all, offer in all these different ways is a new environment for us. So we have to learn the tech, and we have to learn how to provide in all these different ways. And that's new. That's definitely new. And, I think there's a lot less yoga studios than there were before. So, and a lot of us are learning that we have to go out on our own, or that we can go out on our own and don't necessarily need the umbrella as much, or don't have to be 100% dependent on the umbrella of, a yoga studio. We can create our own experience, our own yoga studios. And I think that can be really liberating. And I think that you have to, though, also be, have a self-sustaining accountability around the integrity of that.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely see that as well. And also a lot of teachers that I interviewed, some of them switched completely online, and not all, but enough of teachers I interviewed and I know have said like, I make way more money now than I ever did before the pandemic when I
Yeah.
worked. Yes. Or I don't have to drive around town, hours and hours, sit in traffic anymore. I get to teach from home. I have more time for myself, and I actually make more money because studios aren't taking a certain cut of what you
Yeah.
get directly from the students who pay you directly. So definitely, I think that brought empowerment to teachers. And I know this is not everyone's story, but a lot of teachers, I think pandemic has really brought, like you said, like a freedom or liberation, independence to teachers to certain.
Hmm.
I think it's for me. I think it's great to see.
It is awesome to be able to create your own schedule and not be at the whim of, a studio manager's change of schedule.
Yeah.
That is empowering.
Mhm.
But like I said, I also think that we have to then really be in alignment with our integrity
Mhm.
about our how we're making offerings. Just because I say that, because I see a lot out there where, certain types of trainings or teachings that I've seen that are it's I think if you have a groundwork already for the depth and integrity of what it is to be a yoga teacher, then I think that that's something that you can pull from and create a really powerful and potent experience in this new context. But we certainly see a lot out there that is sort of disembodied or cut from the root of, and is more about making money than, and not that we should be able to make a living, don't get me wrong, but I think we see a lot out there that doesn't offer that sort of richness of experience. It's not all the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Okay, what about the second part of the question with Annie? How have you seen her evolve over the years?
Oh yeah, this is kind of fun. So I just have this, taking from Annie since the last 25 years or so. I have certainly. I mean, we're all humans. We've all evolved. I've changed a lot. Watching her change a lot. It's been really, really beautiful to stay with one teacher for so long. And I remember when she was at Yoga Works and we were doing, 10, 12-minute headstands. Can you imagine her teaching that now? And for those of you who don't practice with Annie, she wouldn't. I don't think she would, but she's teaching unheadstand a lot these days. So just to watch how, and I'm sure her evolution, I say I'm sure because I've heard her say this, or her evolution has also come with her own practice changing and her interest changing and body changing. I have found the same for myself. But yeah, I think there is also, I feel like when I go into her class, there's the thread, the core of Annie that is Annie, that is, but the way that she's been able to shift when she sees something isn't working, as she learns something better, she shifts. And that is really inspiring for me. And I think that is connected to a richer yoga experience or experience of the yogi of the release of ego. And when we can, and like what we were talking about earlier, when we can make the practice bigger than ourselves, and that's what we're offering and giving the experience for the students, I think that watching her do that over the years has been really inspiring for me. And I remember her saying in my 200-hour teacher's training with her, she had said, the ultimate goal of me as a teacher, and I think this is a lineage that she's tapping into here, is for your students to surpass your teachings. And I feel the same. And when she said that, it resonated in a really deep level for me. And I think it's a really beautiful way of looking at teaching. Once again, going back to that idea that we are channels for subtler, more profound experience. And that what we are doing is creating space for that experience for others.
That's so beautifully said. Oh my God. I think that's a probably great way to wrap up this interview. That was so beautifully said. I think when I'm editing this and when I listen back to it, I'm going to probably write it down.
Oh,
Thank you, Bianca. Maybe just one, like to close off, where do you see your teaching going in the future? Is there any thing you want to do or try, or a certain direction you want to take your yoga teaching path towards?
yeah. So I love, as things spark me, I love to pull those things into my practice. And when I feel confident, like it's time, I love to pull those into my teaching. And I've been studying, for example, harmonium for a few years now, and I'm pull that into my classes now, which feels right. But it's taken me quite a few years before I felt like I was ready or the experience was ready to be shared. And that's one thing that I love doing now. And I love collaborative experiences as well. I think this comes to me because of all my years of collaborating as as a performing artist and creator. On this latest winter solstice, I did a collaboration with an artist who I collaborated with for many years. He's a singer and songwriter and fine artist. And we created an experience with lunar yoga, where he provided and enriched the experience with sound and music and voice. And that's another area that I would love to expand upon. Or I'm working with another teacher who wrote a book called The Story of the Poses. And we did a collaborative experience where he told the story of Tadasana, and I sort of enacted that story and then did an embodiment practice around that story. So I love doing things like that to pull in different, experiences for people to have a sort of a richer, multifaceted experience. So, and then I'm teaching at Center for Yoga, and I teach online, and I have everything. You can find my offerings via my Instagram handle, and you can find my offerings also via my website, and more about me on my website.
Thank you so much, Bianca, for all that you do and all taking time to share about your journey today on this podcast, but also all the community you have built and people you teach and students you have. I feel like they're very grateful to have you as a teacher. So thank you so much for being here. And I'll link all of that on the show notes so that listeners can find you and reach out to you if they want to ask you questions or want to sign up for any of your classes. So really appreciate having this chat, and I look forward to seeing you again in person, hopefully very soon.
Hopefully very soon, Reika. Thank you so much. This has been really a lot of fun, and thank you for doing this podcast for our community.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the interview and the conversation I had with Bianca. I just think she had so many beautiful things to say and share. And she just lived such a adventurous life of traveling and touring and performing. And it's so lovely to see her blending her passions of performing acrobatic gymnastic with yoga. And I'm just very grateful that I have her that I could always reach out and speak to if I have something I want to bounce ideas around. And it was such an honor to be able to have this conversation. I hope you enjoyed all the little avenues of conversation that we went into. And if you have any questions or want to give me a feedback, you can always message me at Instagram. My handle is at Reika Yoga, and my website is www.reikayoga.com. I also would appreciate if you could leave a positive review or 5 stars, or subscribe or follow this podcast from whatever podcast platform you're listening from. That is something super easy, quick, free to do that can help my podcast a lot. Also, a reminder that handstand workshop for yoga teacher is coming up with Ali, and that's March 1st, Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. It's in person, it's online, and there will be recordings. So the link to register for that workshop will be on the show notes. So I hope you can make it, and I will speak to you next week.